Welcome to Silicon Bytes. And before we get into the story today, thank you to everybody who's helped support the channel, and especially those who've helped our recent fundraiser for Jiggers Poor to get night vision drones. That has now exceeded the target, and that campaign is drawing to a close. But we are now focusing on getting the documentary film made, and we're also focusing on events that we'll be supporting and running through the year. So if you're able to help, please do that. It is tremendously important. And of course, your help is absolutely invaluable at this time. Today, we're going to look at the potential revolution in Hungary that will overturn Viktor Orban. The revolution hopefully will be through legal means, democratic means, through the upcoming presidential election. But let's dig into that story in a little more detail. Massive protests have erupted in Belgrade and Budapest against the corruption and kleptocracy of incumbent governments. In Bucharest, Romania, thousands gathered to declare their solidarity with Europe and Ukraine and reject Russian attempts to interfere with and corrupt their democracy. Romania is Europe. That is the sentiment on the streets, and there's also anger at the attempt by Trump and his supporters to try and enable this Russian interference and gerrymandering under the pretext of free speech. Streets are flooding with people in an echo of the 100+ days of protest ongoing in Georgian towns and cities in Tbilisi, amongst others. Protesters brandishing their national flags as well as EU flags are chanting "Russia be damned" and its attempts to destabilise their democratic processes and institutions. Orban in Hungary was elected democratically, but his behaviour increasingly resembles that of a dictatorship, and his regime is seen as extremely pro-Russian. He shut down public transportation to prevent people coming from across the nation and gathering in the capital for the protests over the weekend. Opposition leader Peter Magyar declared, "The spring is here, the spring of the Hungarians, and we, together, will end Orban's winter." Orban's regime is facing collapsing poll numbers and massive protests, but he continues to double down on actions that align with the Kremlin's strategic interests. He has put to the EU a list of demands and continues to frustrate and block measures to support Ukraine. It's always worth being specific and providing detail, so here they are. This is a breakdown of Orban's demands to the EU, which will hardly gain any traction, I think. 1. Orban has adopted the slogan, "Creating a Europe of Nations." This means his ongoing attempt to split the EU from within. A Europe of nations means no unified EU, leading to disconnected foreign policies and misalignment on key issues of democratic progress. This is, of course, beneficial to the Kremlin, which seeks to divide countries that it sees as adversaries, makes them weaker so they are easier to threaten, bribe, and coerce. Trust, purpose, and unity, as well as countries that hold common values, are Putin's enemy, and they are the enemy of all autocracies. That's why the EU is likely to be the next target of Putin's operations. Number 2, Hungary under Orban claims a kind of exceptionalism, which is characteristic of many autocratic populist regimes. He calls it equality before the law for all member states. But what he means is to allow exceptions to international and EU law, as well as impunity for states that violate those laws. Orban's Hungary systematically violates European principles. He is busy looting the country, restricting media freedom, pressuring the courts, selling Hungary's foreign policy to the enemies of democracy, such as Putin's Russia, in exchange for personal enrichment. Number 3, Orban's trajectory is increasingly putting him at odds with the EU, its institutions, and its laws. He's called for a restoration of powers illegally taken from nations, which sounds grand, but is in fact a hollow populist slogan. There are no illegal powers. EU countries voluntarily transfer or pool some of their sovereignty and legislative powers for joint decision making. The process is clear and transparent. Certainly, it can be improved. It could be made more democratic, but it's not a grand conspiracy or a cabal of illegality, as the self-interested populists describe it. Orban wants to weaken European institutions so they cannot counteract Kremlin influence. Instead, Orban should leave. Number 4, veto power equals blackmail, as can be seen in the words and actions of Orban. He demands national sovereignty and veto power for national governments. Well, that translates into blocking sanctions against Russia and slowing aid to Ukraine. This is not about protecting sovereignty at all, but is about sabotaging the EU and its foreign policy in support of allies and partners who benefit by destroying the effectiveness of the EU. Well, Orban's Russian masters certainly benefit. Number 5, this is really quite a pernicious slogan and policy here. Orban has demanded that the EU exclude Soros agents from the European Commission and remove lobbyists from the European Parliament. This is barely disguised conspiracy mongering that verges on anti-Semitism. Orban himself is regularly accused of embezzling European funds and having close ties to the corrupting influence of Russian capital. So to point the finger at Soros, etc., is unbelievably hypocritical. Number 6, eliminate the union's debt so as not to mortgage the future of our grandchildren. Well, this line sounds reasonably plausible, laudable even. But it is another tool, another way of preventing the EU from assisting democratic allies, as well as making the hard decisions to invest in its own defence and security. This is ironic, given that Hungary receives billions of euros from the EU. When it comes to helping Ukraine or rebuilding the economy, Orban blocks decisions. Putin approves of this, no doubt. Number 7, in common with other populists and authoritarians, Orban weaponizes immigration without offering any workable solutions as an alternative. He demands that the EU not prevent the National Guard from protecting the borders and deporting migrants from Hungary. But at the same time, Orban turns a blind eye to Russian agents and businessmen who move freely in Europe. In fact, he is an enabling influence on that. Orban is peddling a policy of fear, not genuine security, because he is now the main block to Europe developing genuine military security for the continent against the worst kind of immigrant, one which is guaranteed to steal, rape, and destroy almost to a man, and that is the Russian Red Army. Number 8, Orban clearly has a sense of humour, or perhaps no sense of irony at all. He demands that corrupt dollars and euros should not flow into member states. But Orban himself and his entourage are credibly suspected of embezzling billions in European funds and turning Hungary into Europe's largest conduit of dirty Russian money. The EU, on the contrary, is stepping up the fight against corruption, essential initiatives which Orban constantly blocks. Number 9, in common with Putin, who also professes traditional values but does everything to destroy them, Orban demands the prohibition of unnatural re-education of children. This is a classic diversionary tactic and a tool of authoritarians and aspiring autocrats. While Orban talks about protecting children, real wages are going down and Hungarian families are leaving the country en masse due to the economic problems created by his policies and his kleptocratic ways. Number 10, and here is one from the Dugin Malafeev playbook: protect the Christian heritage of Europe. Orban genuinely proclaims this, but Russia is destroying hundreds of churches in Ukraine, and yet Orban has never once condemned these crimes. We must assume that his defense of values is just a cover for kleptocracy, nepotism, corruption, and blatant shilling for Putin. Number 11, we demand peace in Europe, screams Orban. This is a classic leftist strategy that would have been supported and amplified by active measures of the USSR several decades ago. But if it was followed to the letter, it would result in the evisceration of Europe's ability to defend itself and its allies and partners. Orban is promoting a peace that is beneficial to the Kremlin and would result in the capitulation of Ukraine and a weakening of the EU. Russian peace results in genocide of Ukraine and more wealth for Orban and his elite. And the last one, number 12. This is a big one that Russia will be pursuing now that NATO is looking increasingly feeble and has taken Ukrainian membership off the table. He says EU, but without Ukraine. Orban is blocking Ukrainian membership because the Kremlin has instructed him to do so, of course. Ukraine has proved its commitment to European values much more than the Orban regime. So this is perhaps one of the most hypocritical of these 12 points that we've listed. If Orban is to remain in charge of Hungary, and if he is to remain as a major impediment to European security, then I would advocate for a one in, one out policy. That is Hungary out of the EU and Ukraine in. Though, of course, it would be preferable that the Ukrainian people replaced Orban and steered a course back to democratic values and indeed remained within the EU. And it seems that recent protests and poll numbers are heading in that direction. The people of Hungary are beginning to see Orban for what he is, a Trojan horse for oligarchic influence and Russian control. So what is Orban's next step? He seems to be following the autocratic playbook to the letter and has vowed to crack down on a so-called shadow army of political opponents, journalists, judges and activists in the country who he said were working for foreign powers. This is familiar rhetoric from Moscow, from the puppet regime in Tbilisi, from Fico, and indeed from Trump himself. Orban told a group of several thousand select supporters that his government in the coming weeks will uproot media outlets and other organizations that have received funding from abroad and compared such groups to insects. After today's festive gathering comes the Easter cleansing. The bugs have overwintered, Orban said. We will dismantle the financial machine that has used corrupt dollars to buy politicians, judges, journalists, pseudo-NGOs, and political activists. We will eliminate the entire shadow army. In an inflammatory speech in Budapest to mark Hungary's 1848 revolution against Austrian rule, Orban compared his political opponents to insects that have survived for too long. Again, this is a direct channeling of speeches and terminology used by Putin in the past. He accused politicians, judges, journalists, pseudo NGOs and political activists of taking corrupt dollars at the expense of his own country and have vowed to eliminate the entire shadow army. But note, he has never criticized Putin. He has never criticized Putin's oligarchs or Putin's assets in any way, of course. And he has not criticized China either. Orban reiterated his criticism of the European Union's military support for Ukraine and his opposition to Ukrainian accession to the EU, saying Ukraine's EU membership would destroy, quotes, Hungary, a statement for which he provided no evidence at all. The rulers of Europe decided that Ukraine must continue the war at all costs, and it will get a fast EU membership in exchange using our money, he said. We can only have one answer to that, a union, but without Ukraine. On the issue of sanctions against Russia, Hungary has also been a blocker. The EU has braced itself for a standoff over the issue just last week, but a deal was reached to renew sanctions on more than 2,400 primarily Russian entities and individuals hours before they were set to expire on March 15th. In exchange for Hungary lifting its veto, the EU on March 14th agreed to remove 4 individuals from the list, fewer than half the initial number demanded by Budapest. We know very well that our sanctions are working. They are biting and crippling the Russian economy, Anita Hipper EU spokesperson for foreign affairs said following the renewal. And this is exactly the intended effect, because what we want to achieve with this is to ensure that Ukraine is strong and Russia doesn't have the money and the fuel to put in its war machine. Sanctions list, renewed for another 6 months, includes Putin, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, as well as members of the Russian State Duma and individuals responsible for the illegal referenda in occupied Ukrainian territories. Individuals involved in the kidnapping and forced adoption of Ukrainian children, the atrocities in Bucha and Mariupol, as well as high-ranking officials, military personnel, and Wagner Group commanders are also amongst the 2,400 individuals and entities on the list. Hungary had demanded 5 more individuals be removed from that list, including Russian billionaires Mikhail Friedman and Pyotr Arvin. Oligarch Mikhail Friedman's removal had been high on Hungary's list of demands, but Friedman has close ties with Putin, according to the French sanctions register, and is cited amongst Russia's biggest financiers and as a facilitator in Putin's inner circle. Budapest's ambassador to the EU had explicitly stated removing Friedman as a condition for lifting Hungary's veto, but they were not able to push through on all their demands. But Hungary is set to hold a general election next year, and Orban's incendiary speech may reflect the pressure building on him from the CISA party of Orban's ally-turned-rival Peter Magyar, which poses a threat to Orban's Fidesz party after a steep climb in the polls for TISA. Though Fidesz remains the largest party in last year's European Parliament elections, it scored its worst ever EU election result as TISA took 30% of the vote. This year, both parties have been polling at around 40%, with TISA pulling ahead in the recent polls. Orban vowed to rid his country of those he claimed who work for the interests of foreign powers, saying in a conspiracy-laden speech that his government will eliminate a global shadow army that serves the European Union and a liberal American empire. But Orban's mismanagement of the economy and kleptocratic practices have led to inflation and a cost of living crisis that are helping to fuel dissatisfaction with Orban and his autocratic governance. Magyar has become a lightning rod for the discontent and aims to form a broad coalition against Orban's government. They look down on and exploit the Hungarian people, stun and divide them, and turn them against each other. In the meantime, they laugh arrogantly in our faces, Magyar said. Orban is known to be a Trump ally and is long suspected of acting as a go-between to facilitate communications between Trump and Putin in ways that are difficult to monitor. Orban has applauded the US administration's actions to dismantle US aid, claiming, though providing no evidence, that it was used to fund liberal causes in Hungary aimed at toppling his government. He threatened legal consequences for groups in Hungary that had benefited from funding by US aid and promised to eliminate them. This week, Orban's Fidesz party promised amendments to Hungary's constitution that would allow for Hungarian dual citizens to have their citizenship suspended and be deported from the country if they are deemed to threaten Hungary's sovereignty or national security. Again, this is straight out of the Moscow playbook. Another tool to purge the country of liberal opposition. Also, an amendment appeared to target the LGBTQ plus community. Orban's party has said the annual Budapest Pride event would be banned in public starting this year. Orban, as we've said, is also an opponent of immigration, and in that same inflammatory speech echoed a conspiratorial great replacement theory, a baseless racist hypothesis which suggests there is a global plot to diminish the influence of white people. The battle today is actually being fought for the soul of the Western world, Orban said. The empire wants to mix and then replace the indigenous people of Europe with invading masses arriving from foreign civilizations. In another baseless assertion, he also claimed the empire, that is, of course, the EU, has provided economic and military assistance to Ukraine as it fights off Russia's invasion but in fact seeks to colonize the embattled country. The instrument of colonization is war. The rulers of Europe decided that Ukraine should continue the war, whatever its cost, he said. Magyar, a former Fidesz insider who's split with Orban, has built a strong opposition movement in a relatively short period of time that aims to defeat the Hungarian leader in national elections scheduled for next year. He is focused on Hungary's cost of living crisis and what he says is deep-seated corruption among ruling party elites. Magyar told his supporters that the time has come for his teaser party, which is leading the Prime Minister's Fidesz party in most opinion polls ahead of the elections in 2026. Orban's time as Putin's wrecking ball within Europe may be coming to an end. The massive crowds that rallied in Budapest on Saturday may signal the beginning of the end for Prime Minister Viktor Orban's 15-year rule.